Step outside. Right now, let's go.
Who are you and why are you in my house?
None of your business. Step outside.
You're in my home with guns up. Show me a warrant.
Marcus, you're making this worse for yourself.
Waking my kid up with guns in the hallway? Show the warrant or get out of my house.
Over body.
The officers were already inside the hallway when Malik Carter fully woke up. Flashlights hit the walls. A weapon light swept across family photos. 2 pistols were up at chest level, like they expected a fight. Malik stood there in his boxers with his hands visible, trying to angle his body so his child stayed behind him and out of the line of sight. The lead officer kept barking for Malik to step outside immediately, like the house belonged to the department, for the next 5 minutes. Malik didn't move fast. He moved careful. He kept his voice steady. He asked who they were and why they were in his home. That question irritated them. You could hear it in their tone. They wanted obedience, not a conversation. Before we go further, drop where you're watching from, country or state. And if you watch these stories for the real-world chess match, recording, accountability, people refusing to be bullied, hit like and subscribe. A lot of folks never see how fast a mistake turns into intimidation until it's on camera. Now, here's how it started, because the sequence matters. Malik and Tiana Carter had a routine every night. Doors checked, locks turned, alarm set, cameras running. Not a big dramatic security setup, just basic protection. They had a kid in the house, and they lived in a place where people loved to say it was safe. But Malik didn't confuse quiet with immune. That night was normal. They went to bed, no visitors, no late calls, no chaos. Then, sometime before dawn, the house got hit with movement and noise. Not a polite knock, not a doorbell. More like a sudden presence at the entry that didn't belong there. The next moment, Malik was awake to armed strangers inside. The first thing he focused on was his child. The kid had gotten up, confused and scared, pulled by the noise. Malik stepped into the hallway fast enough to block the kid from walking forward, but not so fast that an officer could claim he charged. Tiana came out seconds later, half asleep, and instantly alert. She saw guns. She saw her partner undressed and cornered in his own hallway. She saw her child behind him. Her brain clicked into one mode: keep everyone alive and document everything. Malik kept trying to slow the situation down. He asked again what they were doing there. The lead officer, Brandt, refused to give a clean explanation. He treated Malik like a problem to manage. He kept repeating the command to go outside, as if stepping onto the porch would magically make the entry legal. That's when the officers introduced their reason. They were looking for someone. A fugitive. A name Malik had never heard in his life. Malik told them he didn't know the person. No hesitation. No maybe. He didn't add extra details that could be twisted, just a direct answer. The normal outcome right there should have been simple. Wrong house. Back out. Apology. Leave the family to calm down. That's not what happened. Instead of ending it, the officers leaned in harder. They kept asking the same thing in different ways, like persistence would produce a different truth. They started scanning the house like they were shopping for a justification. They demanded Malik's ID while standing inside his home, even though he hadn't invited them in, and they still hadn't said anything clear about lawful authority. Malik didn't refuse because he wanted a standoff. He refused because the order made no sense in context. They were already in the wrong place. They were already pointing guns near a family, and now they wanted Malik to help them paper over it with compliance. He asked for a warrant. This is where the officer's story started changing, right on camera. At first, they suggested the entry wasn't really an entry because the door was open or unlocked. That's a convenient explanation because it frames the homeowner as careless and the officers as reactive, not invasive. Malik and Tiana immediately disputed it. They said the doors had been locked. That wasn't an argument about feelings. It was their nightly routine. Then, as Malik kept asking for a warrant, a different explanation started floating around. Now the officers claimed they had been knocking for a long time. That version was meant to make it sound like the family ignored them, like they had no choice but to come in. Those two stories didn't fit together. If the door was open, why the long knocking story? If they'd been knocking forever, why was Malik waking up to them already inside with guns up? The contradictions mattered because they weren't small details. They were the difference between a lawful contact and a serious violation. Brandt tried to end the questions by implying they had legal cover. He hinted at a warrant without producing one. He said it in that confident way some officers do, like the word itself should stop the conversation. Malik didn't let it. Malik kept his hands visible. He kept his voice controlled. He kept repeating the same demand. Show the warrant or explain the emergency that allowed them in without one. No paper appeared, no case number, no judge's name, no dispatch detail that made it sound urgent. Just pressure and impatience. Tiana stayed near enough to keep her child close, but she also positioned her phone so it captured the officers' faces and voices. She wasn't waving it around. She wasn't doing theatrics. She was collecting what they were giving her, shifting explanations and hostile posture. And then came the part that told you exactly what kind of encounter this was going to be. Even with a child in the hallway and cameras visible, the officers acted annoyed that Malik cared they'd brought guns into a sleeping family's home. They minimized it. They treated his concern like an inconvenience. That's not a, we made a mistake. That's a, how dare you challenge us? Malik didn't take the bait. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He did the one thing that tends to make bad behavior unravel. He kept demanding specifics, names, reason, authority, warrant. The officers realized they weren't getting easy compliance. They also realized the footage was building a timeline they couldn't control. So they started looking for leverage, something unrelated they could use to flip the dynamic, something that would make Malik stop focusing on the entry and start worrying about consequences. That pivot began when one of them noticed something in the kitchen area and decided to change the topic. One of the officers shifted his stance and let his flashlight drift past Malik's shoulder down the hall toward the kitchen. That's when the mission changed. Not officially, not out loud. You could just see it in how they started talking. They'd come in claiming they were looking for a fugitive. Malik already told them he didn't know the name. That should have ended the contact. Instead, the officers started acting like he'd spotted a new problem that could justify everything they'd already done. Malik kept repeating the same core point. They were inside his home. They hadn't shown a warrant, and they hadn't explained any emergency. He wanted a supervisor. He wanted documentation. He wanted them out. Brandt didn't answer cleanly. He kept steering back to control. He kept pushing Malik to step outside. It wasn't about safety anymore. It was about getting Malik off his own property line. So the story became, we talked outside instead of, we entered your home. Tiana clocked it too. She didn't argue just to argue. She focused on capturing the parts that couldn't be walked back later. The lack of identification, the lack of warrant, the shifting reasons for entry. She also kept her child close and out of the hallway traffic because these officers were moving like the house was theirs to pace through. Then Brandt tried a different pressure point. He claimed there was marijuana visible in the kitchen. And right away you could tell what that was, a pivot, a bargaining chip. Something to make Malik stop asking about the door and start defending himself. Malik didn't take the bait. He didn't start explaining what was or wasn't in his kitchen. He didn't start confessing to anything. He brought it back to the entry. He wanted the warrant. He wanted the legal basis. He wanted to know why they were pointing weapons inside a family home over a person Malik didn't know. Brandt didn't like that Malik wasn't scared of side quests. So he escalated the tone. He demanded identification again, this time with more edge, like refusing was a crime by itself. Malik didn't need to shout to make the point. He made it plain. Officers don't get to walk into a house without a warrant and then demand papers like the homeowner is crossing a border. At that moment, the officers started stacking contradictions faster. One officer kept leaning on the door was open idea. Another kept implying they'd been knocking forever. Brandt hovered between both stories, depending on what sounded more convincing in the moment. None of them matched the reality that the Carters were asleep and woke up to guns already inside. That mismatch mattered, because Malik was recording the timeline with his words, while Tiana recorded the scene with her camera. Every time the officers changed the explanation, it made the earlier statement look like a lie. Brandt tried to force the conversation into a different lane again. He acted like Malik's questions were the real problem. He treated Malik's calm demand for a warrant like disrespect. He talked down to him. The energy was clear. Comply first, ask questions later. Malik refused that order. He kept his voice even, but he didn't soften the boundary. He told them again that they were being recorded and this would have consequences. He didn't say it like a threat. He said it like a fact. That's when the officers' attitude got nastier. They started mocking the situation. Not openly laughing like it was a joke, but that dismissive tone that says, they don't think your rights count when they're inconvenienced. They minimized the guns. They minimized the panic they caused. They acted like Malik should be grateful they hadn't done worse. Tiana's patience snapped internally, but she stayed controlled. She kept her phone steady. She kept her child behind her now, creating space between the kid and the officers. She understood something Malik understood too. If they could intimidate the parents into emotional reactions, they could later describe that emotion as aggression. So Malik stayed boring, calm, precise, repeating the same demands. He asked for the warrant again. Brandt implied it existed again. Still nothing. No paper, no specific warrant detail, no clear statement of lawful entry. Just a constant push to get Malik outside and a new attempt to use the kitchen claim as leverage. And then Brandt made the pressure tactic uglier. He brought up Child Protective Services. Not because the child was harmed, not because they saw abuse, not because there was an emergency involving the kid. It came right after Malik wouldn't cooperate and right after the marijuana claim got ignored. It landed like a warning meant to scare parents into silence. That was the moment the encounter crossed from reckless to cruel. Because once an officer mentions CPS in a situation like this, the message is simple. Cooperate or we'll bring the system to your door again, in a different form. Tiana didn't crumble. She tightened up. She kept recording. Malik didn't lose control either. He did what disciplined people do when someone tries intimidation. He returned to facts. He demanded the warrant again. He demanded a supervisor. He demanded they explain how they entered on camera with a straight story that didn't change every 2 minutes. And you could see the officers realizing something uncomfortable. They weren't dealing with someone they could fluster into giving them an excuse. They were dealing with someone who understood that the only thing protecting the officers right now was confusion. And Malik wasn't confused. The moment the officers brought up Child Protective Services, Malik understood what they were doing. They weren't investigating an emergency involving his child. They weren't responding to a welfare call. They were using a family system that scares parents as a tool to get compliance after a shaky entry. That's why it landed when it did, right after Malik kept demanding proof of a warrant, and right after he refused to answer questions that didn't make sense. Malik stayed controlled, but his focus narrowed. He stopped entertaining side conversations and forced everything back to the one issue that mattered. The officers were inside his home, in the middle of the night, with guns out earlier, and they still hadn't shown any legal authority to be there. Brandt tried to keep momentum by repeating the same command to step outside. He framed it like a routine step, like Malik was being unreasonable for not doing it. Malik didn't move. He understood what stepping outside would do for them. If they got him onto the porch, the narrative becomes, we made contact outside, and the entry becomes easier to blur. Malik wasn't giving them that reset. Tiana stood near the hallway opening, close enough to keep their child behind her and close enough to capture the officers clearly on her phone. She wasn't trying to perform. She was doing what a lot of people regret not doing later, documenting exactly who said what and when they said it. Malik asked for badge numbers and names. He asked for a supervisor. Then he asked for the warrant again. Brandt answered with the same vague confidence. He kept speaking like the warrant existed, like it was already settled, like Malik should accept it without seeing it. Malik didn't accept it. He asked for something specific. The warrant itself, the reason for it, and the details that would make it verifiable. Brandt didn't produce a document. He didn't give a warrant number. He didn't identify a judge. He didn't provide a case reference. He didn't pull up anything official that could be checked. He just kept talking around it. The longer he avoided specifics, the more the situation looked like exactly what Malik feared, an unlawful entry being patched up with authority language. Then, the officers started stepping on each other's stories in real time. One of them kept leaning on the claim that the door was open or unsecured, which made the entry sound accidental and convenient. Another leaned on the claim that they had been knocking for a long time, which made it sound like the family ignored police and forced their hand. Malik pointed out that those can't both be the clean explanation. If the door was open and that's why they entered, the long knocking story becomes irrelevant. If they were knocking for a long time, it doesn't match the family waking up to officers already inside with weapons and flashlights. The officers didn't resolve the contradiction. They tried to push past it. Brandt switched to a different tactic. He made Malik's refusal to comply the issue instead of their entry. He demanded Malik's identification again. He treated it like an order Malik had to follow, simply because police said it. Malik refused again, and he explained why in plain terms. He told them they were not going to flip this into him proving who he was, while they refused to prove why they were there. That's when the tone turned personal. Brandt started talking to Malik like Malik was the problem for insisting on his rights, like Malik was making it hard, like Malik should stop asking questions and just cooperate. The other officer backed him up with that same energy, pressure through irritation. They weren't calm professionals trying to correct a mistake. They were acting like Malik owed them a solution. Tiana stepped in and demanded the same information Malik demanded. Who are you? Why are you here? What gives you the right to be inside our home? Where's the warrant you keep mentioning? She didn't have to shout to make it sharp. The officers reacted like her asking those questions was disrespectful. That reaction was revealing, because questions aren't threats. Questions are what people ask when the other side won't explain themselves. Then came the part that made the footage feel especially disturbing. One of the officers minimized the danger of what they had done, bringing guns into a sleeping family's home and forcing a father to stand half-dressed while trying to keep his child safe. The attitude wasn't regretful, it was dismissive, like Malik should stop complaining and accept it as normal. That's the mask-off moment, because it shows they didn't see a family being terrified as a serious problem. They saw it as collateral. After that, Brandt circled back to the kitchen claim. Marijuana. Consequences. He tried to use it as a lever, as if introducing a new threat could make Malik stop talking about the entry. Malik refused to change topics. He didn't argue about what the officer claimed to see. He didn't explain. He didn't negotiate. He kept the same demand: show a warrant or leave. At this point, the officers were boxed in by reality. They were looking for a fugitive Malik didn't know. They couldn't get Malik to confirm anything helpful because Malik wasn't guessing or talking loosely. They couldn't produce a warrant to justify being inside. They couldn't control the narrative because the family was recording and the officers had already contradicted themselves. Their body language started shifting. They stopped pressing inward. They began drifting toward the exit while still trying to keep verbal dominance. They continued issuing commands, even as they backed away, trying to leave the impression that they were ending the encounter on their terms. Malik didn't follow them outside. He stayed in the doorway area, still keeping himself between the officers and his child. He made sure the record was clear while they were still in earshot. They entered without consent. They never showed a warrant. They gave conflicting explanations, and they escalated with unrelated threats, including child protective services. The officers left without presenting any valid warrant. No paper, no clear documentation, no accountability in the moment. Just a retreat and an attitude that suggested they expected the family to stay quiet because the alternative was trouble. And the Carters stood there in the aftermath with one harsh truth. The only reason nobody got hurt was because Malik stayed disciplined, while armed strangers tried to bully their way out of a mistake. After the officers left, Malik and Tiana didn't calm down. They went into problem-solving mode. They checked on their child first. The kid was shaken and kept asking if the police would come back. Malik kept it simple and reassuring. Then he and Tiana started preserving evidence before anything could be lost. Tiana saved every file immediately: the interior camera footage, exterior footage, and her phone recording. She backed it up. Malik wrote down a clean timeline while it was fresh. When they woke up, where officers were standing, when guns were visible, what the officers said about the door, when the warrant claim appeared, and when the conversation shifted to marijuana and child protective services. The next morning, Malik contacted the police department and asked for the incident number and the legal basis for the entry. He also asked directly about the warrant the officers claimed they had. The response he got wasn't a clear confirmation of any warrant. It was vague and evasive, which matched what happened in the house. That same day, the Carters contacted a civil rights attorney, Avery Ross. Ross didn't focus on anger. She focused on proof. She asked for the raw footage, not edited clips, and she told them not to debate the department or post anything impulsively. She wanted the story locked down with timestamps and documents. Ross then built the case around the simplest issue: authority and consistency. The officers were inside a private home during the night. The family said there was no consent. The officers implied a warrant but didn't show one. Their explanations for entry changed on camera. When Malik demanded legal justification, they introduced unrelated leverage: marijuana, then child protective services. Ross filed records requests for dispatch logs, call notes, body camera footage, reports, and any warrant tied to that address. The goal was to compare what the officers said on video versus what they wrote afterward. The Carters also spoke to neighbors. One neighbor confirmed hearing sudden commotion and police activity, but did not recall a long period of knocking or announcements. That mattered because it challenged the "we knocked forever" explanation. When the department finally gave a formal response, it leaned on general language about looking for a fugitive and implied they acted appropriately. Ross responded with specifics: what emergency justified entry, what facts connected the suspect to that house at that time, and why officers repeatedly referenced a warrant they couldn't produce. Once the footage began spreading, the department's tone changed. They moved from denial to damage control. They wanted meetings. They wanted to resolve it. The case ended the way these usually end when the video is bad and the paperwork is weak. The city negotiated. The Carters reached a settlement. The department did not frame it like an admission, but the payout and internal review spoke for themselves. There were also policy changes tied to the incident: tighter verification before home entry during fugitive searches, stronger supervisor involvement, and clearer identification and documentation requirements. The city wanted fewer lawsuits like this, and this one was too clear on video to ignore. For Malik and Tiana, the win wasn't going viral. It was forcing the system to deal with what happened instead of burying it. They upgraded security, kept copies of everything, and learned the hard lesson a lot of families learn. When authority shows up wrong, documentation is protection. So here's the question. If officers entered your home and then couldn't produce a warrant while their story kept changing, would you stay quiet? Or would you do what Malik did and keep forcing them to justify every step. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Share this with someone who thinks it can't happen to regular people, and subscribe for more stories where accountability actually lands.
I said step down. Don't make this a thing.
No, tell me why you're here first.
You don't get to dictate how this goes. Step off the porch.
You can't just show up at my home and start giving orders with no reason.
Stop resisting.
I'm not resisting.
I'm standing on my porch.
Terrence Holloway thought he was doing the most normal thing in the world, standing on his girlfriend's porch in Dayton at 3 a.m., finishing a cigarette, until 4 police officers rolled up and immediately started talking to him like he was trespassing. They ordered him to step off the porch. Terrence didn't yell or posture. He stayed planted and asked what law he had broken. He explained that he lived there and treated the porch like what it was, part of a home, not a street corner. He also made it clear he wasn't going to answer questions or move positions just because officers wanted control of the situation. That's the detail people miss when they reduce it to, he didn't comply. Terrence wasn't refusing a lawful command in the middle of a crime scene. He was refusing to let a vague demand become the new law. The officers didn't respond with a specific violation. They kept repeating the order to come down. They pushed for identification. Terrence refused to identify himself and kept pressing for an actual legal reason behind the contact. He asked for a supervisor early because he recognized where this kind of encounter usually goes when officers feel challenged. A doorbell camera recorded the whole thing from a wide angle. It captured the officer's approach, the short back and forth, and the moment the tone shifted from pressure to physical action. Instead of walking away or slowing down for supervision, the officers closed distance. Within moments, they rushed Terrence, forced him to the ground, and put him in handcuffs. Even as they restrained him, he continued demanding an explanation for why they were confronting him in the first place. He kept repeating that they had no valid reason to approach him like this while he was at home. In the immediate aftermath, police framed the situation as justified. Their public position leaned on a familiar narrative. They described the neighborhood as a high-drug crime area and claimed Terrence was loitering. They also pointed to his refusal to identify himself as part of what they considered obstruction. Terrence rejected the entire framing. He said he wasn't loitering because he lived there. He said the officers created the conflict by trying to treat his porch like public space. He also argued that their approach wasn't about safety. It was about authority and ego. From his perspective, they used force because they couldn't produce a real legal basis for the stop. Then the story got more complicated. After the arrest, officers found an outstanding warrant connected to an earlier drug possession case. That discovery became a key issue because it raised an obvious question. Did the officers know about that warrant before they initiated contact, or did they stumble into it afterward? If they already knew, the entire encounter should have started with that reason. If they didn't know, the warrant looked like something found later to justify a stop that began without a solid foundation. The department also claimed the viral clip showed only a small portion of a longer encounter. They said officers were acting on reasonable suspicion based on information from a source alleging a man matching Terrence's description was involved in drug activity and might be armed. Officers also said they noticed suspicious circumstances involving a nearby vehicle and Terrence's behavior on the porch. Terrence's response stayed consistent. He said he was outside at home doing nothing illegal. He said the officers exceeded their authority. He said they abused their power. He wanted them fired. By the time the video spread, the case stopped being just a street-level arrest and turned into a credibility test. People weren't debating whether Terrence was polite enough. They were debating whether police could manufacture a detention on private property, call it reasonable suspicion, and then use force when the person refused to play along. Once Terrence got booked, the situation shifted from a physical confrontation to a paperwork battle. That's where these cases usually get decided, not on the porch. In reports, charging decisions, and how a department explains itself once video exists. Officers charged him with resisting arrest and obstruction. Those charges mattered because they're flexible. They don't require police to prove an original crime happened. They often depend on one idea. The person didn't cooperate with what officers claimed they were allowed to do. That framing only works if the officers can clearly explain what they were doing in the first place. The department's public defense leaned hard on context. They called the neighborhood a high-drug crime area. They described Terrence as loitering. They said the viral clip was only a portion of a longer encounter. Then they added a justification that shows up a lot after public backlash. A source had allegedly provided information about a man matching Terrence's description being involved in drug activity and possibly being armed. They also claimed there were suspicious circumstances involving a nearby vehicle and Terrence's behavior on the porch. That's the official story in its cleanest form: area, tip, suspicion, refusal to identify, escalation. Terrence kept his response simple. He said he was at home. He said standing on a porch at a residence wasn't loitering. He said the officers came in looking for submission, not answers. He also said the force happened because they couldn't name a law he broke and didn't like being challenged. From his perspective, they exceeded their authority and abused power, and he wanted them fired. The video made that argument easier for him because it captured the start, not the middle, not the aftermath, the opening moments. If a department claims an encounter was longer and more complex, the first question becomes, why didn't the reason show up early and clearly before the takedown? Then the warrant details surfaced. After the arrest, police discovered an outstanding warrant tied to an earlier drug possession case. That discovery didn't automatically validate the porch contact. It created a timeline problem. A warrant can justify an arrest when officers know about it and act on it. It doesn't magically justify force used before the warrant was even part of the encounter. If the warrant was found only after Terrence was in custody, it couldn't explain why 4 officers ordered him off a porch in the first place. If officers knew beforehand, the sequence should reflect that from the start. That's why the question about what they knew and when they knew it became central. The case stopped being about whether Terrence should have answered questions and became about whether police initiated the contact without a lawful basis and then built the justification afterward. Terrence's background in court compliance mattered here because he understood how narratives get structured. When a report uses broad language like high crime area and suspicious behavior, those aren't facts by themselves. They're labels. Courts and investigators still look for specifics. What exactly did the officers observe? What exactly did they articulate? And what did they do before escalating to force? That's also where the supervisor request came back into focus. Terrence didn't ask for a supervisor as a stunt. He asked because supervisors create accountability in real time. They slow things down. They force officers to explain their basis instead of freelancing. In the footage, his request didn't change the officer's behavior. The escalation still happened fast. In the days after, the video circulated and the conversation widened. Some people took the department's side automatically, treating refusal to identify as the main issue. Others focused on the first principle. Police don't get to order someone off private property without a real reason, then punish them for not playing along. The department tried to keep control by insisting the clip lacked context. That strategy can work when there's no clear record of the beginning. It works less when the beginning is exactly what went viral. By the end of that initial week, Terrence wasn't just dealing with charges. He was dealing with the bigger fight, forcing the city to commit to one timeline, one justification, and one explanation that could survive review. Once Terrence got out and had a chance to breathe, he went straight into the mode he used at work, lock the timeline down, and force everyone to commit to facts. That meant one thing first: getting the records before the story could be cleaned up by repetition. His side started requesting everything that would show what actually happened before the porch contact turned physical: dispatch logs, CAD entries, radio traffic, body camera footage from all 4 officers, and any notes tied to the alleged source information. The department had already leaned on that tip explanation in public. If they were going to hang their whole justification on it, it needed to exist in a form that could be examined, not just described. Terrence also pushed on a narrower question that sounded simple, but controlled the entire case. When did the officers learn about the warrant? A warrant isn't a vague suspicion, it's specific. It has identifiers. It has a time it was checked and confirmed. If the officers knew about it before the first command to step off the porch, the encounter should have started with that basis and the report should reflect it clearly. If they didn't know until after the arrest, then the warrant couldn't explain why they initiated contact or why they escalated that fast. That's where the department's explanation started to feel unstable because it leaned on two different justifications that don't always fit together cleanly. One justification sounded like a street stop, high crime area, loitering, refusal to identify, suspicious behavior, nearby vehicle. The other justification sounded like a targeted contact. A source said a man matching his description might be involved in drug activity and could be armed. If it was a targeted contact, the key details should exist somewhere concrete. What was reported, when it was reported, how specific it was, and whether the officers could reasonably connect that information to Terrence, standing on a porch at a residence. If it was a general street stop, the explanation had to answer a different problem: why a man on private property became police business at all. Terrence's approach stayed consistent. He didn't try to win through emotion. He focused on making the department pick one narrative and defend it without hiding behind vague language. Resisting and obstruction charges also looked different once the video kept circulating. Those charges rely on the idea that police were lawfully doing something, and the person unlawfully interfered. The moment the initial contact starts looking unjustified, the foundation for those charges starts getting shaky. That's why his legal strategy centered on the beginning, not the ending. The department, meanwhile, tried to recenter the conversation around cooperation. That's a common institutional reflex. It reframes the issue as behavior instead of authority. It avoids the harder question: did officers have the right to order him off the porch in the first place? Terrence refused that framing. He kept pointing back to the same basic sequence. Officers arrived, issued commands without stating a law, pressed for ID, and escalated into force when he insisted on a supervisor and an explanation. The case turned in a way that happens more often now than departments like to admit. The doorbell camera didn't just create outrage, it created a reference point. Every official statement got compared to those first moments. Every report got measured against what people could see. As the records process moved forward, the pressure started hitting the people above the officers too. Supervisors and city attorneys know that public incidents don't stay at the level of the arresting officers. They become policy questions, training questions, discipline questions, liability questions. Terrence wanted accountability in plain terms. He wanted the charges dealt with fairly. He wanted the officers' conduct reviewed as excessive and unjustified. He wanted consequences that meant something, not a quiet counseling memo and a press line about how the public didn't see the whole thing. By this point, the mask-off moment wasn't a single sentence on the porch. It was the pattern after the fact. How quickly the story expanded once the video made the initial justification hard to defend. By the time the city realized the porch video wasn't going away, the strategy shifted. Early on, the department tried to frame the situation as routine policing in a rough area. That worked for people who always default to the badge. It didn't work for anyone watching the timeline closely. Terrence's side kept pressing for the same things over and over because those are the things that decide outcomes. What the officers claimed, what they wrote, what the dispatch and camera footage showed, and whether the stated reasons for contact matched the moment they chose to escalate. Once that pressure tightened, the case split into two tracks. One track was criminal: resisting arrest, obstruction. Both depended on police being lawfully engaged in the first place. If the initial contact looked unsupported, those charges didn't look strong. That's why the defense stayed centered on the beginning of the encounter, instead of arguing about the exact seconds on the ground. The other track was administrative and civil. That track cared about risk. City risk, department risk, supervisor risk. Video cases don't just threaten an officer's credibility. They threaten the department's ability to defend itself in every future case where that officer testifies. That's expensive. It's also why departments sometimes dig in hard at first, then quietly start looking for an exit. Terrence kept his public position straightforward. He said he was at home. He said the police had no valid reason to approach him the way they did. He said they used force because he wouldn't submit to questions without a legal basis. He demanded consequences. The department kept repeating its justification. Reasonable suspicion, source information, possible weapon, suspicious circumstances, and the neighborhood label. They also kept insisting the public saw only part of the encounter. That line became less useful every time someone replayed the start and asked the obvious question. If there was a lawful basis, why didn't it show up clearly before the physical rush? The warrant discovery stayed in the background like a trap for the department's narrative. If the warrant was known beforehand, it should have been front and center from the first moment. If it wasn't known beforehand, it couldn't justify the initial escalation. Either way, it didn't erase the core question. Did they have a lawful reason to order a man off his own porch and arrest him when he refused? That's where accountability usually comes from in real life. Not from a single dramatic hearing. From the moment a city attorney says the quiet part out loud, this is hard to defend in front of a jury. As the process moved forward, the most common outcome in cases like this is a layered resolution. The criminal charges don't end with a "we were wrong" press conference. They tend to shrink or disappear through court decisions, dismissals, or negotiated outcomes that avoid a trial. That prevents the officers from having to explain the porch decision under oath in a public forum. It also prevents the city from putting the video on repeat in front of a jury. At the same time, internal discipline often happens in a way departments prefer: limited public detail, administrative language, policy reminders, training requirements, and sometimes a more direct consequence for the officer who escalated fastest. The point isn't always to announce punishment. The point is to reduce future liability and show there was action. Terrence's long-term win wasn't just the legal outcome. It was control of the story. The footage made it difficult for the department to turn him into a caricature. He wasn't caught doing something criminal on camera. He was caught standing his ground on private property and demanding a reason. That matters because it changed how people around him responded. Some neighbors who normally stayed quiet spoke up once the video circulated. People who'd had their own late-night encounters recognized the pattern immediately. Vague suspicion, command voice, escalation when the person doesn't play the role expected. Even people who didn't like Terrence's refusal to identify still had to admit one thing: the officers acted like the porch belonged to them. Terrence also had to live with the reality that being right doesn't make the experience light. Getting rushed and arrested at a home leaves a mark. It shifts how you view routine police presence. It shifts how you move at night. It also makes you realize how fast you're free to go can turn into put your hands behind your back when an officer decides the interaction is about dominance. Over time, the case became a local reference point, not because it was the most extreme incident ever recorded, but because it was so ordinary. That's what made it scary. A porch, a cigarette. 4 officers, a command with no clear legal reason, a takedown when the person asked for a supervisor. That kind of video forces a department to clarify what its officers are allowed to do in residential spaces, how they use high crime area language, and what actually counts as reasonable suspicion. It also forces a quiet correction. telling officers that refusal to cooperate isn't the same thing as a crime, and because I said so doesn't survive cameras. Terrence's message stayed consistent through the whole thing. He didn't claim he was above police contact. He claimed he was entitled to the same constitutional limits as anyone else, especially at home. He wanted a system where officers couldn't turn curiosity into detention and then turn detention into charges when the person refused to submit. That's the lesson here. If someone with legal system experience can get treated like this on a porch, anybody can. If a doorbell camera didn't catch it, the report would have been the only version that mattered. If the timeline didn't get challenged, reasonable suspicion would have stayed a vague shield instead of a claim that has to be proven. So let me ask you, if you're on your own porch and police roll up with commands, but no clear reason, what would you do? Would you step off just to make it end? Or would you hold the line and force them to name the law? Drop your take in the comments. Share this with someone who thinks just comply always works. And if you want more stories where accountability shows up through recordings, records, and real consequences, like and subscribe.
Hand me the bag, now.
What's the legal basis for that?
You boys always do this. Sit there acting smart like I don't know what I'm looking at.
Watch your language. Watch your language. Call a supervisor if you think you have probable cause.
I'm not asking again. Give me the bag or you're both going in cuffs for resisting.
Racial profiling collided with constitutional limits inside Westgate Shopping Mall when a rookie officer decided two black men sitting quietly on a bench looked like a problem he needed to solve. Officer Trevor Maddox had watched them for nearly 15 minutes without seeing any crime. He still walked in like he had proof. He demanded a black duffel bag, accused them of criminal activity, and tried to force a search without probable cause. The moment turned ugly fast, and it didn't stay private, because the mall had cameras, bystanders had phones, and Maddox said things that couldn't be explained away later. Before we get into how this started, tell me where you're watching from in the comments, country, state, or city. And if you follow stories about accountability, civil rights, and people keeping their composure when power gets abused, like and subscribe so you catch the next one. Maddox stood in front of the bench with his body angled like he was blocking the exit path. He focused on the bag first. He told the men to hand it over. He spoke like compliance was expected, not requested. The two men didn't match his intensity. Marcus Reed and Julian Cross stayed seated. They kept their hands visible and their voices level. They asked why he wanted the bag and whether they were being detained. When Maddox repeated the demand without giving a lawful reason, they refused consent and told him they weren't handing over property without probable cause. That refusal flipped Maddox's mood. He raised his voice and treated their calm boundaries like disrespect. He accused them of acting suspicious and suggested they had something to hide. He tried to turn the refusal into the justification, which is a common move when an officer doesn't actually have one. Marcus stayed steady and asked again for the legal basis. Julian backed him up and told Maddox that consent wasn't required, and intimidation wouldn't change that. Maddox escalated instead of stepping back. He made racially charged comments that weren't about behavior or safety. His words made it clear he had decided who they were before he ever spoke to them. He also threatened to arrest them for resisting, even though they weren't physically blocking him or fighting him. They were simply refusing a search. Then Maddox pulled out his taser. He didn't fire it, but he brought it into the conversation on purpose. He held it in a way that sent the message, cooperate or this gets worse. In a crowded mall, that kind of posture doesn't just scare the person in front of you. It draws attention. Shoppers slowed down. A few people stopped near the kiosk and the food court entrance. Phones came out. Mall security cameras covered the atrium from multiple angles, and the bench area sat under bright lighting with clear sightlines. Maddox kept pressing. He demanded the duffel bag again, closer now, louder now. He said he had seen a handoff and knew what it meant. He implied it was drugs. He framed it like he was about to make an arrest, and didn't want them making it harder. Marcus and Julian did not argue with him the way a regular civilian might. They stayed controlled, asked direct legal questions, and didn't give him emotional reactions to feed off. That control only irritated Maddox more because he wanted the moment to end with obedience. He leaned towards the bag as if he might grab it. Marcus stopped him with a clear boundary and told him he was not authorized to seize property without probable cause. Julian told him to call a supervisor if he believed a crime had occurred, because threats and a taser weren't a legal standard. At that point, Maddox was in a corner of his own making. He had already accused them publicly. He had already raised the stakes. He had already used racist language. Backing down would have felt like losing, so he tried to win with pressure. He repeated the word resisting, trying to create a reason to arrest them. He talked about cuffs and detention. He implied they were about to learn a lesson. That's when Marcus and Julian identified themselves as federal agents. They didn't shout it, they didn't perform it. They stated it clearly and gave enough information to make the point without exposing sensitive details in front of a crowd. They also made it clear the bag wasn't personal luggage. It contained protected material tied to an active federal investigation. Maddox's confidence dropped immediately. His posture shifted. His voice changed. He tried to walk back the tone of the encounter like it had been a simple misunderstanding. He began to speak more carefully because he finally understood there could be consequences beyond a routine report. Marcus told him to step back and stop interfering. Julian told him to call his supervisor right away. Neither of them asked politely at this stage because the situation had already crossed the line. Mall security moved closer. The supervisor on duty, Elena Park, had been watching from a distance and now approached cautiously. She didn't know who to believe yet, but she could see the officer was agitated and the crowd was growing. Maddox hesitated instead of backing off immediately, and that hesitation mattered. It showed he was still trying to hold control even after realizing he was out of his depth. This didn't start with Maddox responding to a crime. It started with him watching two black men existing in public and deciding that was enough to suspect them. Westgate Mall had its own quiet pattern of bias, too. Security calls about suspicious people happened regularly, and those calls often centered on who looked like they didn't belong. Maddox fit neatly into that environment. He was 8 months into the job, eager to prove he was proactive, and already building a record of stops that made people feel targeted. Complaints existed, but they didn't stop him from getting assignments like this, because his numbers looked good on paper. Marcus and Julian had chosen that bench for practical reasons. It gave them a wide view of foot traffic and camera coverage. They weren't hanging around for fun. They were in the middle of an organized crime investigation that had been running for months, and the handoff Maddox thought was a drug deal was part of a controlled flow of intelligence. The third man who dropped the duffel bag hadn't lingered. He hadn't talked. He didn't act nervous. He simply delivered it and left. Maddox saw the bag, filled in the rest, and treated assumptions like evidence. Now those assumptions had turned into threats, racial remarks, and a visible use of force pressure in a crowded mall. By the time Maddox's supervisor arrived, this was no longer an argument between three people. It was a public scene with witnesses, cameras, and two federal agents who understood exactly how to document misconduct without losing composure. Maddox called for a supervisor, but he didn't do it the way officers do when they're trying to de-escalate. He did it the way someone does when they're trying to protect themselves. He kept talking while he waited, still standing close to the bench, still acting like the situation was under his control. Marcus and Julian didn't let him reset the narrative. They stayed calm and made the same points in the same order. No consent, no probable cause, no authority to seize the bag, and no further interference. They also told him the bag contained protected federal material connected to an active investigation, which meant this had crossed into a level Maddox wasn't trained to handle. Mall security supervisor Elena Park hovered a few steps away. She kept her voice low and asked Maddox what was going on. Maddox gave her a fast version that made him sound reasonable and made the two men sound suspicious. He pointed at the bag like it was the only thing that mattered and implied he had observed a transaction. Elena didn't challenge him. She didn't fully side with him either. She looked around and saw the crowd, the phones, and the fact that Marcus and Julian weren't yelling or moving aggressively. She also saw the taser in Maddox's hand earlier, and that image didn't match the calm tone Maddox was trying to put on now. Within minutes, Maddox's supervisor arrived. Sergeant Dana Whitcomb came in with the posture of someone who expected another routine mall issue. She took one look at the scene and realized it wasn't routine. She saw bystanders filming, a rookie officer standing tense, and two men who looked calm enough to be either extremely confident civilians or trained professionals. Whitcomb asked Maddox for the reason for the stop. Maddox started with the handoff and the duffel bag. He described it like it was a clear drug exchange, even though he hadn't seen anything illegal, hadn't heard any conversation, and hadn't observed any behavior that met a lawful threshold. He leaned heavily on vague terms like suspicious and based on training and experience. Whitcomb asked him directly what crime he believed he had probable cause for. Maddox didn't answer cleanly. He tried to argue that refusal to cooperate added suspicion and that the bag needed to be checked for safety. Marcus stepped in, still controlled, and explained the facts in a way that boxed Maddox in without turning it into a shouting match. He stated that Maddox had demanded the bag without probable cause, made racially charged remarks, and threatened arrest for resisting based solely on refusal to consent to a search. He made it clear that the encounter had been recorded. Julian added that this wasn't just a bad stop, it was interference. He explained they were working an active federal investigation and that the bag contained sensitive federal intelligence. He didn't reveal the operation, but he made the point that Maddox had inserted himself into something he had no authority over and tried to force access to protected material. Whitcomb's face changed. She stopped treating it like a mall complaint and started treating it like a liability. She asked Marcus and Julian for identification. They produced it quickly and discreetly without making it a show for the crowd. Whitcomb verified what she needed. Once she saw federal credentials, Maddox became background noise. She told Maddox to step back and stop engaging. Maddox tried to defend himself. He said he was doing his job. He said he had to act on what he saw. He claimed he didn't know who they were. That excuse didn't help him because the issue was never that he didn't know who they were. The issue is that he acted without lawful cause, escalated when they asserted rights, and introduced racial hostility into the interaction. If Marcus and Julian had been ordinary civilians, the same behavior would have been just as unconstitutional. The only difference was that federal agents had the knowledge, authority, and documentation to force accountability immediately. Whitcomb tried to pull the scene back under control. She asked Marcus and Julian what they needed to safely leave and continue their work. They told her they needed space, and they needed the local officer to stop interfering. They also made it clear that their agencies would be notified and that this would not be handled as an informal coaching moment. Elena Park asked if she should clear the area. Whitcomb told her to keep people moving and preserve security footage. That instruction mattered because it showed Whitcomb already understood how this would be reviewed later, not as a story, but as evidence. Maddox stood off to the side, visibly frustrated. He wasn't apologizing. He was trying to manage how he looked. He kept scanning the crowd, noticing phones, noticing faces, realizing he couldn't control what people had captured. Marcus and Julian left the bench area with the duffel bag, moving calmly and without rushing. The way they walked out told everyone watching that they weren't the problem. The problem was the officer who had approached them looking for one. As soon as they were clear, Whitcomb pulled Maddox aside. She asked him whether his body camera was on. Maddox said yes. Whitcomb asked what exactly he said before she arrived. Maddox tried to summarize it in the safest way possible, but he couldn't talk around what had already been recorded. Whitcomb didn't argue with him in public. She did what supervisors do when they realize something is going to turn into a case. She shut it down, separated him from the scene, and started documenting. Before leaving, she spoke briefly with Elena Park again and told her to flag the relevant camera angles and preserve them. She also asked for a list of any security staff who witnessed the encounter from the beginning and any incident notes. Elena agreed, because now the mall understood this could turn into litigation and subpoenas. Back at the patrol car area, Wickham made calls. One went up her chain, another went to internal affairs. She didn't need a full review to know Maddox had created a serious problem. The question wasn't whether there would be an investigation. The question was how wide it would go once investigators started asking why a rookie with complaints was still being put in positions where he could keep doing this. Maddox kept talking, trying to explain his decision-making. Wickham cut it off and told him to write a full report and say exactly what he observed, exactly what he said, and exactly what legal basis he believed he had. That directive was a trap Maddox didn't fully understand in the moment. A detailed report doesn't save you when the video shows a different story. It locks you in. The mall went back to normal within an hour, but the footage didn't disappear. There was body camera audio, bystander video, and mall surveillance. There were also witnesses who heard the racial comments and saw the taser come out. That same night, Marcus and Julian briefed their chain. They didn't do it for drama. They did it because interference in an active operation is a security risk, and because an officer making threats and racial remarks in public is the kind of thing federal partners take seriously. By the next morning, this was no longer just a local supervisor handling a rookie mistake. It was already moving toward internal affairs, command staff, and city leadership. Because once federal agencies get involved, local departments lose the ability to quietly bury the issue. Internal affairs opened the case within 24 hours, not because a supervisor wanted to be thorough, but because the incident had too many hard facts to ignore. There were multiple recordings from the mall, at least 2 bystander videos, and Maddox's own body camera. The first review made one thing clear. Maddox had initiated the confrontation without a dispatch call, demanded property without probable cause, escalated after a lawful refusal of consent, and used racially charged remarks while threatening arrest. That combination wasn't a bad interaction. It was a civil rights problem. Lieutenant Miguel Sandoval from Internal Affairs ran the investigation the way these cases are supposed to be run. He started with timelines, not opinions. He pulled mall security footage, mapped camera angles, and aligned them with Bodycam timestamps. He collected bystander videos, requested the original files where possible, and logged witness names. He interviewed Elena Park and any mall security staff who had been nearby. He also identified bystanders who were visible recording and asked for statements. Maddox was ordered to provide a full written report. He tried to frame the situation around suspicion and officer safety. He emphasized the duffel bag handoff, like it was a proof of criminal activity. He claimed the men were uncooperative and implied their refusal created the need for detention. The recordings undercut him. The audio captured him pushing for the bag without explaining a legal basis. It also captured him bringing resisting into the conversation before any physical resistance existed. His tone changed sharply as soon as they refused consent, and his racial comments came out during that escalation. The taser display was visible enough to remove any doubt about intimidation. Sandoval then widened the scope because that's what policy required when an incident suggested profiling rather than a one-time error. He pulled Maddox's stop history over the prior 8 months. He reviewed body cam audits that had already been performed. He requested any informal memos or supervisor notes connected to prior complaints. That's where the department's bigger problem surfaced. There had been earlier complaints about Maddox's stops, especially in mall zones and traffic stops near the same shopping district. Several citizens had alleged he escalated quickly, demanded searches without cause, and spoke in ways that felt racially targeted. In more than one case, a supervisor had written the resolution in a way that treated it like a communication issue rather than a constitutional issue. Some complaints were marked not sustained without meaningful investigation, even when there was body camera footage available. Sandoval documented that pattern. He didn't need every complaint to be proven to show risk. He needed to show the department had warnings and failed to correct behavior. When a rookie builds repeated allegations within 8 months, it usually means one of two things: the officer is a problem or supervision is weak. In this case, it pointed to both. Command staff got briefed as soon as the federal angle was confirmed. The FBI informed the department that Maddox's actions had interfered with an active operation. They did not share sensitive details, but they didn't need to. Interference plus a recorded rights violation was enough to draw federal attention. The city attorney's office was also notified early because civil claims were now predictable. At the same time, the footage started spreading beyond internal channels. One of the bystander videos hit social media within days. It showed the crowd, Maddox's posture, and the escalation. The audio was clear enough to pick up the racially charged remarks. The clip circulated fast locally, then wider once people realized the men being targeted were federal agents. That detail didn't change the legality of what happened, but it changed public interest. People who might have dismissed it as he said, she said, couldn't dismiss it as easily when the targets were trained law enforcement professionals describing the same violations viewers were watching. Local reporters started calling the department for comment. The first statement was cautious and generic, emphasizing an ongoing review. That statement didn't slow the story down. It made people look harder because the video didn't look ambiguous. More people came forward. Former detainees and drivers who had interacted with Maddox contacted advocacy groups, attorneys, and reporters. Some had complaint numbers. Some had screenshots of emails. Some had their own recordings. Even when those prior incidents weren't identical, they had the same theme: a stop that started with vague suspicion and turned into pressure for consent and threats when consent wasn't given. Sergeant Dana Whitcomb got questioned internally as well. Investigators asked what she knew about Maddox's record, what training he had received, and whether she or anyone else had been instructed to coach him earlier. Sandoval requested training logs, Bodycam audit notes, and any documentation of corrective action. The department could not credibly claim this was unpredictable if there were multiple earlier red flags. Maddox was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome. He reacted the way officers often react when they realize documentation is not on their side. He tried to argue that he was being targeted for doing proactive policing. He tried to reduce the racial remarks to misunderstood language. He tried to frame the taser as standard officer safety. None of that solved the central issue. The core issue was that he created a detention without legal justification, threatened arrest for asserting rights, and used race as part of how he treated the situation. Those are not gray area mistakes. Those are the kinds of acts that trigger discipline, decertification review, and lawsuits. By the end of the second week, Internal Affairs had enough to recommend termination. The department moved quickly once it became clear the case would not stay internal. Maddox was fired. The department also began the process that would lead to revocation of his certification because the findings involved dishonesty risk and constitutional violations, not a minor policy violation. The city tried to contain the fallout with statements about training and commitment to community trust, but the public response focused on a different question. How many times did people complain before it took federal agents to make the department act? That question pushed the case into a second phase. It was no longer just about Maddox. It was about supervision, ignored complaints, and whether the department had a culture that treated profiling as acceptable as long as it produced numbers. The civil rights lawsuit hit the city fast because the evidence was clean. Multiple videos showed Maddox demanding the duffel bag without probable cause, escalating after a refusal to consent, making racist remarks, and threatening arrest for resisting when there was no resistance. The federal element made it worse because it highlighted interference and forced the department to take the matter seriously instead of quietly closing it. During discovery, the plaintiff's attorneys didn't just focus on the mall incident. They pulled Maddox's prior stop history and earlier profiling complaints. The pattern mattered more than his excuses. The case showed the city had warnings and didn't correct them, which put leadership and supervision decisions under the microscope. The city settled for $850,000. The payout wasn't the only consequence. The settlement terms forced changes the department couldn't delay anymore. Bias training, civilian oversight, stricter stop and search documentation, and regular body camera audits with real review standards instead of random spot checks. Supervisors also had to justify stops and searches on paper in a way that matched video, because the gap between reports and recordings had become part of the problem. Maddox didn't recover from it. He was fired, his certification was revoked, and his name became attached to a public example of how quickly unconstitutional policing turns into liability when there's footage and oversight. The lesson was simple. Authority doesn't replace probable cause, and confidence doesn't replace the Constitution. If you build policing around assumptions and ego, the outcome is predictable. People get targeted, trust gets destroyed, and the public ends up paying for it. What would you have done if you were sitting on that bench, being treated like a suspect for no legal reason? Drop your take in the comments. And if you want more stories like this where accountability actually lands, make sure you like, share, and subscribe.